How to Earn $1 Billion from the Paul Graham Essays, June 2026. This is based on a talk Paul Graham gave at the Oxford Union.
Since this is apparently the future Prime Minister's Club, I'm going to tell you about something. It would be good if more politicians understood. I'm going to tell you how people become billionaires. I hope this will be useful to you, even if you don't plan to go into politics. Those of you who don't become Prime Minister can become billionaires instead. The reason I know about this topic is that 21 years ago, Jessica and I started something called Y Combinator. If you haven't heard of Y Combinator, it's a cross between an investment firm and a school for startup founders. Since we started it in 2005, we've funded about 6,500 companies. Starting a successful startup is the most common way to become a billionaire. So in effect, I've spent the last 21 years training people to become billionaires. So far, about 30 of them have, but there are many more in the pipeline. So you can imagine how astonished I was last month when an American politician said that it was impossible to earn $1 billion. I felt like a skating coach hearing someone say that it's impossible to do a triple axel. Of course it's possible. It's hard, but it's possible. She wasn't saying, of course, that it's impossible to become a billionaire. Obviously that's possible, nor was she talking about the distinction between income and capital gains. She wasn't making a point about accounting. What she meant was that it's impossible to get that rich without doing something bad, without cheating in some way. A couple days later, I was talking to the founder of a startup I'd funded. I began by asking, as I usually do when I meet a founder, what her growth rate was. 93% last month, she said. I pointed out that this meant her net worth was also growing at 93% a month. She was getting richer at a stupendously rapid rate, and yet she hadn't been doing anything bad. The reason her startup was growing so fast was simply that users loved what she'd built. So she could feel from her own experience how wrong that politician was. She wasn't exploiting anyone. Exactly the opposite, in fact. The reason her startup was growing so fast was that she and her co-founder had been working their asses off to make their users happy, and as a result, the users had been telling their friends. And that gets you exponential growth. Later that day, I was talking about her case online, and someone replied that having a few million and growing at 93% a month was radically different from being a billionaire. I suspect many people would agree with this statement, but it turns out not merely to be false, but false in a very illuminating way. So I would like you all to do me a favor, please. I would like you to take out your phones and calculate a number. I know this may seem contrived, but I promise it will be useful for you. I'm going to have you do the most common kind of calculation I do as an investor, and the experience will bring home to you what startups are all about. If we interpret his statement in the most conservative way and assume that a few means two, her company has to grow 500 times for her to become a billionaire. So we are going to calculate how many months of 93% growth it takes for something to grow 500 times. To do this, we want to calculate the log base, 1.93 of 500. The easiest way to do that is to go to Google Search, which lets you do calculations right in the search box. So go to Google Search and type log 500, 1.93. If you type that right, the answer you get is about 9.45. That is how many months of 93% growth it takes to become a billionaire, starting from 2 million. A couple million and 93% growth are not, in fact, radically different from $1 billion. They're 9.5 months apart. Now you see why, when I meet a founder, the first thing I ask about is their growth rate. But I don't want anyone to accuse me of using unrealistic numbers, so let's take a more conservative growth rate. Let's see what happens at 15% a month. That's not rare at all. I constantly encounter startups growing at 15% a month. If your revenues grow at 15% a month, how much more will you be making 5 years from now? To calculate that, we need to find 1.15 to the 60th power, since 5 years is 60 months. So go to Google again, and this time type 1.15 to the power of 60. The answer should be about 4,384, meaning in 5 years, your startup will be making 4,384 times as much. If you're currently making 10,000 a month, in 5 years you'll be making about 44 million a month, or 526 million a year. And at that point, if you own as much of the company as founders typically do, You will be a billionaire. In the real world, growth rates tend to slow down a bit. A very successful startup will probably be growing faster than 15% a month in year one and slower than 15% a month in year five. But you end up in about the same place. If you start a startup in your early 20s, it's definitely possible to be a billionaire by the time you're 30. Hard, but possible. I wanted you to feel this by doing the calculation yourselves, because now you understand one of the reasons people start startups. Exponential growth is like magic. It generates outcomes that seem impossible. And that's why some politicians distrust it. They don't understand the math of exponential growth, so when they see people becoming what seems to them impossibly rich, they assume they must have cheated. But now you at least understand, from having done the math yourselves, that you don't have to cheat to become a billionaire. You've seen for yourselves that there are only two numbers in the calculation: the growth rate and how long it continues. If it's impossible to make $1 billion without cheating, which of those two numbers is impossible? It's certainly not impossible to grow at 15% a month without cheating. Startups do that all the time, and how long you can continue to grow at that rate depends on the size of the market. Obviously, for you to grow 4,000 times, there has to be at least 4,000 times more demand. But that's all you need. And how could you possibly cheat to increase the market size? If you're only planning to become Prime Minister, you can stop paying attention now. We've proved that it is in fact possible to earn $1 billion, because it only depends on two numbers, one of which startups routinely hit without cheating, and another that cheating couldn't possibly affect. But if you actually want to become a billionaire, we should go into more detail, especially about that first number, the growth rate. To grow at a consistent rate every month, you have to make something so good that people tell their friends about it. And in fact, that's the other reason I always begin by asking founders their growth rate. It shows whether they've built the right thing. So how exactly do you make something people like so much that they tell their friends about it? The problem with market economies, and also the great thing about market economies, is that it's hard to make something customers want that they don't already have. As soon as a new, satisfiable need is discovered, people rush to satisfy it. So you're going to have to discover a need that no one else knows about yet. How do you do that? By feeling the need yourself. You're young, and usually young founders should make something that they themselves want. You don't have enough experience yet to know what other people need. But at the same time, your own needs are uniquely valuable because your needs predict future demand. You're the age when people start using new things. Whatever you and your friends start using now, everyone is going to be using in 10 years. Since your intuitions about other people's needs are usually a crap signal, and your own needs are an especially valuable one, you should usually listen to the second signal. You should make something you and your friends want. Making something you and your friends want doesn't mean you have to build a consumer product. Maybe you and your friends are molecular biologists, and there's something cool that could be done now to DNA that everyone else has overlooked. Maybe you and your friends are into drones. The idea doesn't have to have a wide appeal. It literally just has to appeal to you and your friends. Don't worry about the second number, the market size. Since you predict future demand, the market will grow. And it's always possible to expand into adjacent markets. All you need is a beachhead in the territory of unsatisfied need that you can expand from. How do you get an idea like that? The answer is one of the most counterintuitive things about startups, which is saying something, because there are a lot of counterintuitive things about startups. But the way to get the very best startup ideas is not to look for startup ideas. If you're consciously looking for startup ideas, it will make you too conservative. You'll lop off the outliers, because the very best startup ideas tend to sound so lame at first that you'd reject them if you were consciously looking for startup ideas. That's what has prevented them from being discovered. Imagine what a bad idea Apple or Facebook or Airbnb seemed at first. How many people are going to want their own computers? How is a company going to make money from undergrads stalking one another online? Who's going to pay to sleep on an airbed on someone's floor? We know how these ideas turned out, so it's easy to rewrite history, but I remember very well how bad Facebook and Airbnb sounded at first. We funded Airbnb, and we thought the idea was bad. The reason we funded them was just that we liked the founders. So how do you find startup ideas without looking for them? by working on projects with your friends. That's where the very best startups come from. Initially, they're not even meant to be companies. They're just something people built because they thought it would be cool. That's how Apple and Google and Facebook all started. None of them were meant to be companies at first. The reason this works is what I told you earlier. You predict future demand. So if you just build random stuff you think would be cool, the things you build will actually be far from random. This is one of those cases where your unconscious mind knows more than your conscious mind does. Anything that genuinely seems to you like it would be a cool thing to build has a high probability of leading to a good startup idea, no matter how preposterous it sounds. Whatever you build couldn't possibly sound more preposterous than a startup we funded in 2006 called Justin.tv. It consisted of one guy, Justin Can, walking around with a camera on the side of his head, live streaming everything that happened to him. But this company ended up doing quite well. In fact, you've probably heard of it, but under its new name, Twitch. The key to starting a successful startup is to understand some group of users so well that you can make exactly what they want. If you're young, you can and should use the hack of making something for yourself. You understand yourself. But this is just an instance of the more general rule. Only by understanding users very deeply can you make something they love so much that they tell their friends about it. And only that can get you the exponential growth you need to make a startup really successful. There are other ways to get rich than by starting startups. Some of those do require you to exploit people. But startups are the most common way to become really rich, and if you want to start a successful startup, the key is not exploitation, but empathy. What do users really want? What could you do for them that would make their lives dramatically better? That kind of empathy is what we look for in founders, and what we cultivate in the ones we accept. How people become rich in your society is one of the most important things to understand about it. You can't let your beliefs about this be determined by ideology, or movies, or historical examples that are centuries old. You must look at the world around you and see how it's actually done. If you want to do it yourself, obviously you'll be forced to understand how it's done. So I don't worry too much about you. The ones I worry about are the future prime ministers. You need to remember this talk. So for you, I'm going to summarize the key ideas. There are two numbers that determine how big a startup gets, and thus how rich its founders become: the growth rate and how long it continues. You get the first by making something users like so much they tell their friends. You get the second by being in a big market. If you grow exponentially into a big market, your startup will become valuable, and you, as a shareholder, will become rich. You not only don't have to cheat to make this happen, it will happen automatically if you just keep making customers happy.
So that was Paul Graham's take on how people become billionaires. And I think the most interesting thing about that speech is that despite the title, it's actually not really about becoming a billionaire. At least that's not what I took away from it. What Graham is really talking about is how value grows and how badly we sometimes underestimate exponential growth. The example with the startup growing 93% in a month sounds almost absurd at first. And obviously, almost no company can maintain that kind of growth for very long. But that's not really the point. The point is that our brains are pretty good at understanding linear growth, but terrible at understanding compounding. We understand 1 plus 1 plus 1. What we struggle to intuitively understand is what happens when something keeps multiplying. And you see this everywhere in real life. Investing is an obvious example, but the same thing applies to learning a skill, building a business, growing an audience, exercising, or even building relationships. A tiny improvement doesn't look impressive today, neither does another one tomorrow, but repeat it for years. And suddenly the difference can become enormous. So one takeaway from me is simply never underestimate something that compounds. But I think Graham's more important argument comes afterwards. Because you can't just decide that your company is going to grow exponentially. There has to be a reason people keep coming. And his answer is very simple. Build something people genuinely want. Something so useful or so enjoyable that they naturally tell someone else about it. And I like that because it flips the usual idea of entrepreneurship around. A lot of people start with the question, how can I make a lot of money? Graham is basically saying that this is the wrong place to start. A better question would be, what can I create that people actually care about? Because if nobody wants what you're making, no marketing strategy in the world is going to save you forever. But if people genuinely love it, growth becomes much easier. And his advice about startup ideas is interesting too. He basically says, Don't obsess over finding the perfect business idea. Build things you find interesting. Solve problems you personally experience. Experiment. Because sometimes the ideas that initially sound ridiculous are exactly the ones everyone else overlooked. Airbnb is probably the perfect example. Imagine hearing that pitch before Airbnb existed. People are going to let complete strangers stay in their homes. That sounds much less obvious when you don't already know how the story ends. The same goes for Facebook, Twitch, and plenty of other companies. Once something succeeds, we tend to rewrite history and pretend that the idea was obviously brilliant from the beginning. Usually, it wasn't. And that's probably another good lesson. Good ideas often look strange before they look obvious. Now, I do think Graham simplifies things a little. Building something people love doesn't guarantee you'll become rich. Timing matters, competition matters, luck matters. Markets change, and a company can create real value without ever becoming a $1 billion business. But I don't think that weakens his main argument. Because the deeper message isn't follow these steps and you'll become a billionaire. It's more like stop treating wealth as the goal itself. Focus on usefulness. Understand people. Solve something that actually matters to them. And keep improving it. I think that's also why Graham ends up talking so much about empathy. Because ultimately, a good business requires you to understand another person's problem. What frustrates them? What takes too much time? What costs too much? What do they wish existed? And can you make their life noticeably better? If you can do that for one person, you have something useful. If you can do it for 1,000 people, you have a business. And if you can eventually do it for millions of people, the numbers can become enormous. So if I had to reduce the entire speech to one simple thought, it would probably be this. Don't start by asking how to become rich, ask how to become useful. Because wealth may or may not follow, but value has to come first.